Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Center runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade, and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I'm Juan Castañeda, Director of the Vinson Center, and today we'll be hosting Jennifer Burns. Jennifer Burns is Associate Professor of History at Stanford University, a Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and author of Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and American Right. She has written for the New York Times, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and Dissent, and has discussed her work on The Daily Show, the Colbert Report, and elsewhere. Today, we'll discuss Jennifer Burns' latest book, Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. Jennifer, one of the aims of your book is to restore the fullness of Friedman's thought to his public image. How would you summarize Friedman's economics and political philosophy?
Okay, starting with a small question. Let's see. I'll take those in two pieces and try to bring them together. When I think about Friedman's economics, really what is at the center of it is what was known in his day as Chicago price theory. And this is, in one level, just microeconomics, the sort of analysis of choices under scarcity, supply and demand. But Friedman really took this idea and extended it beyond economics to become a framework for policymaking, for thinking about the proper role of government, and also for thinking about macroeconomics, including things like floating exchange rates and the quantity theory of money in some ways echo that basic idea. So that's the economics, and it really flows quite naturally into his political philosophy, which after much sort of struggle and inner thought, Friedman decided the fundamental value of his philosophy was freedom. And so capitalism and reducing regulations on markets and preserving what he called the heart of the contract, that was all in the service of freedom to make choices. And from there, he judged social systems and governments according to how much freedom they accounted to their citizens. And so the two end up really intertwining in that he visualizes markets as free as possible. They need some structure and support from government, so he's never an anarchist. And he also wants a society in which people are free to make lots of different choices, be they good choices or bad choices. And he really is quite a libertarian. He's not paternalistic at all. He actually doesn't care if people make terrible choices. What he cares about is that they have the ability to make those choices.
Mm-hmm. I kind of think of a current academic or an intellectual figure with the popularity Friedman enjoyed at the time, not only in the US, but also in many other countries. His presence in public debates and public policies truly extended beyond academic circles. Could you comment on his impact and popularity at the time?
Yeah, I really ended up writing about three Friedmans. There's Friedman the economist, Friedman the policymaker, and Friedman the public intellectual. And in the beginning, he's really just an economist. But because he's one of the few working to create an alternative to the Keynesian economic consensus, he ends up using his economics or developing his economics into a platform to propose a whole raft of different policies and then to step into the public sphere as a representative of that alternative. And so it starts in the 1960s when he becomes a supporter of the Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. And he's then, after that, he's asked to write a column for Newsweek, which is one of the major news magazines in the United States. And we have to remember it's a much different media environment. So there's a few television shows and a few magazines that really are capturing a large audience and have very little competition. So Friedman becomes known through his Newsweek columns. And then over time, as the industrialized countries of the world suddenly face inflation, stagflation, suddenly Friedman's ideas become very important to explaining what's happening and to proposing alternatives. So he's greeted warmly by figures like Margaret Thatcher in Britain. He's asked to consult with the Pinochet government in Chile. And it's around this time that he wins the Nobel Prize, which really vaults him into a new moment of prominence. So he's now a lauded economist. He's advising presidents. He was quite close to Treasury Secretary George Shultz during the Nixon administration. And then his connection to Chile causes an enormous wave of global controversy, which makes him even more famous. And then really topping it off in the 1980s, he and Rose Friedman produced a television show, Free to Choose, that airs in millions of U.S. households. It's a 10-part TV series, and it becomes sort of part of the wave of the Reagan Revolution, or the shift towards more conservative social and economic policies in the United States. And so he really is a sort of triple threat. He's operating in so many different domains. And part of it is, like I said, because of the media landscape. Part of it is because of the power of his ideas and how fresh and different they are from what people are hearing. And part of it is he's a wonderful spokesperson for these ideas. He's quick on his feet. He speaks very clearly. He makes complicated things seem simple. And he enjoys himself the entire time. So he really is this sort of happy warrior, and people are drawn to him and they always want to hear more of what he has to say.
Well, this links very well with the next question. It's very much about the subtitle of your book. It's very provocative. Milton Friedman as a conservative, not just a conservative, but the last conservative. However, Friedman, or the way I see Friedman, is very much as a disruptor, very much against the establishment. He actually believed that, it is much better to have small government and also open markets, as you put it, and also warned against regulation because it would benefit mostly the incumbents in the market. Because often what incumbents do is to capture the regulator, the government.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I actually do think we could definitely consider him part of the broader liberal tradition, the classical liberal tradition. But I'm going to say there's two ways in which that title I do think is accurate. And I go back to this division that we kind of started with, that Friedman is the economist and Friedman is what maybe we'll call political economist. And in terms of him being an economist, one thing that really distinguishes his career, and I talk about throughout the book, is he was on the early wave of economists turning to mathematical techniques and analyses and models as really shaping and defining the field. And then he stopped and he turned away and he went back to an older set of methods and an older set of ideas. So he continued doing this sort of empirical research, really data-driven work that fell out of fashion with other economists who were really focused on macro models. And he also worked to revitalize, he called it a revitalized quantity theory of money, which, has very long roots, but goes back to Alfred Marshall, to Irving Fisher in the United States. And he really worked to kind of revitalize this idea and show its continued relevancy. So if a conservative is one who conserves, Friedman sort of single-handedly conserved these older approaches and these older ideas and brought them into 20th century macroeconomics. Now, in terms of his political economy, his political philosophy, you're right. He's much more open to the new. He's much more focused on individualism than preserving traditional social forms. But this really comes from his life in the United States and the United States political context. And so this is like, if I had my way, everyone around the world would use the same political terminology, but that's not the case. So American conservatism is actually distinct from many other conservative traditions in other countries because it incorporates really in its DNA these ideas that Friedman represents, preserving the market, trying to limit the size of government. There isn't a sort of God and crown impulse that you might have in older, more established European countries. So those elements of that mingle in American conservatism under traditionalism. But in most countries, what would be called liberal and would be opposed to conservative thinking is in the United States incorporated into the conservative establishment. At least that was the case in the 20th century. And that's one of the stories I tell in the book because Friedman plays a really critical role as an expositor of economic ideas who's comfortable working with conservative politicians from Goldwater to Reagan, who is very close to conservative entrepreneurs and intellectual thought leaders like William F. Buckley. And he's very comfortable in that movement. That's where he chooses to associate himself. And so he brings in large part this set of economic ideas that might otherwise be considered liberal into the American conservative context. And furthermore, in the American context, since the New Deal, the mid-1930s, the word liberal becomes very associated with what what we might think more of a social democracy in other parts of the world, becomes very associated with the Democratic Party, Franklin Roosevelt, which Friedman is really opposed to. So in some ways, it's a semantic puzzle that really owes a lot to the distinctiveness of the U.S. political context. I will say, though, that this idea of the last, that I think really is the provocation or the question I'm posing to my reader, because in the early decades of the 21st century, we've seen a real questioning of whether that free market consensus is still part of the conservative worldview, is still part of the conservative identity. And when you have, Republican presidential candidates threatening extremely high tariffs, that's a real departure from Friedmanite economics. And so that's sort of the question I have, like, where do these ideas go if they're not folded into the conservative establishment? One thing I really try to show in the book is that Friedman's ideas, by the end of his lifetime, were broadly influential among Democrats, among American liberals. They really had transcended kind of the partisan origins and become considered as common sense. So I argue in the book, these ideas are still with us, even if they have fewer champions today. They've kind of become the air we breathe, the water we swim in without knowing it's there.
Yeah, this is precisely the point that I wanted to discuss with you in more detail, Jennifer. As you put in your book, and I'm quoting from your book, Friedman wanted a political world of maximum individual choice and an economic system where individuals were likewise free to bargain and contract at will. Both of these required a reduced state, although one is still empowered to provide a basic income floor and maintain a monopoly on the currency. With escalating government debt and anti-free trade sentiments, not many seem to pursue Friedman's agenda in the U.S. anymore.
Yeah, so there's a couple of aspects to that. One is this is something Friedman started to see in his lifetime. And one thing I want to show in the book is that, again, he's not an anarchist. And in the early part of his career, he has a fairly robust vision of what the state should and could do. And he never really abandons this. He sees pretty consistently a role for the state in monetary management. Pretty consistently, he promotes this idea of a universal basic income, which is the state accepting responsibility for really putting a floor under all its citizens, providing a minimum standard of living. But what he starts to observe is that across every different presidential election, the dynamic of the state is growth. And that very rarely do politicians cancel programs or shut down agencies or reduce spending. In fact, they do the opposite. And so he becomes more pessimistic over time. And he's really only wrestling with and not fully admitting that this dynamic is as much a Republican dynamic as a democratic dynamic. And so it also causes him, though, to start shifting away from an earlier discomfort with budget deficits and an earlier commitment to sort of fiscal responsibility, because he ends up concluding somewhat pessimistically, okay, the dynamic of government is growth. It will always grow. That's sort of what it is. And so how do we stop it? And he comes up with really two solutions. One is tax limitation, which happens in many different American states. And that's a sort of constitutional solution to the problem. So you would change the framework under which government operates rather than expect politicians, individual politicians or political parties to make change, because he sort of realizes they have no incentive to do so once they're elected. And secondly, he comes to believe that deficits can be a sort of informal constitutional check on spending, that politicians will be afraid of deficits, will not want to, will be incentivized to avoid them and will then limit their spending. This doesn't seem to have worked. And it's in the sort of late stages of his life that we're seeing that this doesn't work. And one thing I talk about in the book is that in the aftermath of Bretton Woods, when capital controls are lowered, U.S. debt becomes enormously attractive across the globe. And there's suddenly a global pool of buyers for this debt, where before it would have really just been more limited to the U.S. population. And so there is no consequence for debt anymore, deficits, or running up the debt. And so that it doesn't serve to check government growth as he hoped it would. And I think we're now many decades into that dynamic. And And so far in the United States, nobody's had to pay the piper yet. It's probably not going to last indefinitely. I would say as a historian who studies change, nothing is going to last forever. But I think that's the dynamic Friedman started to grasp. And so, yes, I think his ideas are not being followed, and he knew, and he was frustrated. He said, Rose and I feel like we won the battle of ideas, yet still the state seems to grow. And so I would say that growth of the state is not necessarily a matter of ideas. It's more a matter of kind of inbuilt dynamics and path dependency. And if it's any ideas at work, it's what are the incentives of people, elected politicians and people within the state. Their incentives are, like anyone, to have more responsibility, more power, more agency, more effect in the world. And that's just a dynamic that keeps on going. So I do think that there's not really going to be a sunset on Friedman's ideas. I think they fall out of fashion and they come back. I mean, there's been a sort of renewed interest in his discussion of inflation as we've entered a new inflationary period, which, for many years was not at all an issue. And so it may be that if we come to a crisis caused by government overspending, there will definitely be voices who will go back to Friedman and say, why don't we try this approach instead? Look, why don't we set up a more limited government and embrace it as a good thing so that we avoid these types of crises? But I would say we're kind of in motion in this dynamic right now.
Yeah, actually, you refer to the latest inflation episode in the States at the end of the book, in the last chapter. And you refer to this episode in 2002 at the conference to honor Milton Friedman on his 90th birthday. Bernanke, the then governor of the Fed, acknowledged the Fed's mistakes during the Great Depression years. And in Bernanke's own words, I would like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you are right, we did it. We are very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. Well, however, despite Friedman and Schwartz's success and, if you like, intellectual recognition by the Fed, by the chair, the one at the top of the Fed at the time, since the outbreak of the global financial crisis, central banks have become more discretionary and have very much disregarded the effects of money on inflation. How do you explain the neglect of Friedman's postulates and indeed of monetarism in recent years, both in academia and by the Fed?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of different ways to look at that. So, and let's think about what did Friedman and Schwartz argue? And they're kind of two different arguments. They're arguments for an emergency and arguments for ordinary time. And the emergency argument is that the Fed needs to provide liquidity. And the reason for this is because the case study of them not doing so is the Great Depression. And Friedman and Schwartz have this, incredible book that shows how much money was lost in the system because of the Fed's inaction. Also because of the way the banking system was set up, there was no sort of backstop. So that lesson has really been very deeply absorbed by, I would say, all modern central bankers, that we can't just stand by in a crisis. We have to provide liquidity no matter what. The other piece of Friedman's argument is that monetary policy should be guided by rules. And his specific rule was a money supply growth rule that should be, say, 4% a year. A computer can do it. Policymakers shouldn't be responding to this or that quarterly report. So those cut in slightly different directions. I would say the emergency piece has been absorbed, and that's kind of the basic way central bankers think. Following the rules has also made a lot of headway. So one of the most important frameworks now is the Taylor rule, which is an interest rate rule that's really in the lineage of Friedman. It derives from that. I think we could even say ideas about inflation targeting or the releasing of frameworks. A large part, that's Friedman's legacy. And I talk about in the book how shrouded in mystery central bank policy was and what a critical role Friedman played through his criticisms of encouraging the banks to say what they were doing. And then, of course, the rational expectations movement that flowed out of his work also made forward guidance and communication really important. So there's so many features of the central banking world today that stem from ideas that Friedman pushed. Now, going to the great financial crisis, there was a huge provision of liquidity. And at this point, central bankers are not looking at the aggregates that Friedman thought were so essential. And the aggregates that Friedman developed, I talk about this at length in the book, they really were most efficacious in the highly regulated world of the 20th century up until the 1970s. And when that world broke down, the aggregates became less useful. They're not completely, they shouldn't be completely ignored, as I would say the last few years have taught us, but they're much more difficult as an instrument and gauge of monetary policy. So focus has shifted to interest rates. Now, there's a narrative that, the Fed was so expansionary post-GFC and we saw no inflation. So therefore, all of monetarism has been debunked. Well, one thing that the monetarist critics of the Fed often missed was that at the same time the Fed started paying interest on reserves and it raised reserve requirements. So a lot of that expansion was on balance sheets. It didn't actually go into the economy. And so that's an important distinction, and that is different than what happened in post-COVID. Money was put directly into the bank accounts of Americans for them to spend. And that's when we see this huge spike in M2, which was Friedman and Schwartz's favorite aggregate, and that's when we see the inflation unfolding. And here is really where it would have been good for the powers that be to be remembering their Friedman and to be more cautious in making that helicopter drop of money, because they wanted to create inflation, but they didn't worry enough about how much inflation they could create. Say by create inflation, they wanted to stimulate the economy because of the COVID crisis. The other thing that's really important to note is that prior to COVID, the Federal Reserve in the United States had shifted its operating guidelines. They have a very short few paragraphs, and typically the Fed has had a dual mandate in which it tries to balance low inflation and low unemployment. And with a few subtle wording shifts, the Fed changed that prior to the crisis to say they are now targeting, instead of 2% inflation, they're targeting 2% average inflation, which gives them more latitude for it to go up or down. And they also kind of rearranged the way they prioritize unemployment and inflation. So there was a real shift, a subtle but real shift in the Fed's mindset prior to the onset of COVID that really shaped their response to the crisis. And I would argue is one of the factors that went into that inflation that we saw and that we're still experiencing today.
Yeah, that was going to be the distinction that I was going to make between a narrow definition of money and a broader definition of money that indeed expanded in 2020 and 2021 by, if I remember well, 20 to 25% in the US. Mm-hmm. And of course, according to Friedman or any monetarist really, that couldn't be neutral in terms of inflation down the line. May I finish with a question on how to guide any potential reader interested in the topics? Of course, I would encourage them to read your book, Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. But which of his other works, his works precisely, or perhaps his TV programs, would you recommend to start with?
So I'm a big fan of A Monetary History of the United States. I've been looking at it recently, and it really stands the test of time in terms of just the combination of the narrative and the analysis. And for anyone who's familiar with United States history, is this fascinating story of all the events that you know about presented through the lens of a new actor, which is money. They're really tracking this sort of fundamental measure, and it goes from the Civil War to the present, or to their present, which is the mid-'60s. And it really strikes me as it kind of expands your mind and gets you thinking about how much things can change over a short period of time, and how much things can change in our economic structures, our sort of maybe economic constitution. And so I think that is a place to start. Now, that's a big book, so maybe that's not a place to start. One could also look at Capitalism and Freedom, which is a very different Friedman, written for a popular audience, written in the mid-1960s. And what's interesting for today's reader is if you look at it, you'll see many of these things he's talking about. You say, oh, yeah, of course, yeah, that happens. Sure, school vouchers, everyone knows about that. At the time, these were outlandish, controversial ideas, really, what is shocking is how many of them have come to pass. So you would have to kind of use your imagination to go back to the 1960s, but it would take you there. And then finally, for those who would prefer to watch, the television series Free to Choose is on YouTube, and that also really stands the test of time. I mean, it has some wonderful, vintage moments, but what's really striking is Friedman, in the second half of each episode, he gets together in the University of Chicago's Harper Library with a cast of characters, some of whom agree with him, some of whom do not. And they really go at it hammer and tongs. And they are debating, they are disagreeing, but they're in the same room and they're not calling each other names, and they're having the kind of real exchange of ideas and respectful engagement with people who think differently that our world really needs today. So I would encourage listeners to go check that out.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your time, for joining us today, and for your fascinating book on Milton Friedman. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for listening. This podcast is edited by the Vinson Center at the University of Buckingham. You can visit our website at vinsonCenter.com to access our podcast series and know more about the programs and events we host, both in Buckingham and in London. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive timely information on the Vinson Center's agenda.